Good morning, everybody. But just before I begin, the SHIUR is sponsored for the academic year by Dr. and Mrs. Menachem Marcus in memory of their beloved aunts Irma Haas and Hilda Myers. So thank you for that sponsorship. It is wonderful to see everybody again. Just once again, for those of you who are wondering where my father went, so my father was here for a couple of weeks. Those of you who were here the last couple of weeks, I'm sure you enjoyed having him back and hearing from him and learning from him. I know he very much enjoyed it as well. My parents now returned to America for the summer, so I am privileged to be here and to learn with you through the summer, and I'm looking forward to that. Thank you so much. That's so sweet. Thank you. So I'll move it closer. I was just moving it back just because of people on the sides, but I'll try to project. I'll try to speak loudly. So what I wanted to do today is, again, we're continuing Parshat HaShavua, trying to find a meaningful idea from the Parsha. This week's Parsha, there's a lot to talk about. One of the things that I wanted to stress now, and that is important for us to keep in mind, is something that I've learned from my father. My father likes to talk about a lot, specifically when it comes to Sefer Bamidbar, is that whenever you're learning Chumash, particularly this is really true of Sefer Bamidbar, we have to really make sure and remember that we're reading the story on two different levels. Okay, the first level, of course, is the actual text itself, the actual narrative as it unfolds. As we're reading about OUisrael, Bnei Yisrael, as they're in the Midbar, continuing through the desert on their way to Eretz Yisrael. But there's another level, and that is, of course, that the Torah is meant to speak to every single generation. That this journey that OUisrael are taking throughout the Midbar, their journey from Har Sinai, doesn't just launch their own journey, but it launches the journey of OUisrael throughout the ages. And of course, the Torah has relevance. The stories of the Torah have relevance not just for the generation in the Midbar, but for us as well. And so, what I wanted to keep in mind as we are going through the topic that we're going to discuss today is to really understand how many of the messages that we're going to learn from this story very much connect to today as well. And what I want to do is I want to kind of use as a jumping off point, we're going to be talking about the story of Korach, the situation with Korach. What exactly was Korach looking for? What was Korach trying to accomplish? I'd like to use as a jumping point a very interesting anomaly in the very beginning of the Parsha. If you look with me, please, at source number 1. We're going to read the first few psukim just to kind of set the stage for the story. The Torah tells us in source number 1, the beginning of this week's Parsha, Vayikach Korach ben Yitzar ben Kahas ben Levi v'Datan v'Aviram b'nei Eliyav v'on ben Pelet b'nei Reuven. And Korach, the son of Yitzar, the son of Kahas, the son of Levi, took, and Dasan v'Aviram, the sons of Eliyav, and On ben Peles, the sons of Reuven. Vayakumu lifnei Moshe v'anashim b'nei Yisrael chamishim u'matayim nisiyei haida kurei moed anshei shem. And they stood in front of Moshe, and another group of people, another group of men from Bnei Yisrael, 250 princes of the congregation, men of importance. Anshei Shem means these are men of importance. Vayikalu al Moshe v'al Aaron. They gathered in front of Moshe and Aaron. Vayomru alehem rav lachem. And they said to Moshe and Aaron, "This is a lot for you." Again, the exact translation of rav lachem is an interesting discussion. For our purposes, they're basically accusing Moshe and Aaron of taking too much power. Ki kol ha'ida kulam kidoshim. The entire nation, the entire community is holy. Uvitocham Adonai. And God is amongst us. Umadua tisnaseu al kahal Adonai. Why are you raising yourselves up against the congregation? Okay, so this is the claim, the main claim that Korach ve'adato, that's the way it's referred to, Korach and his congregation or his group, they claim, they challenge Moshe and Aaron. Now, let's take a look again, those first couple of psukim. There's one major question, really a technical question, that comes out from the first two psukim that all the Mefarshim jump on, and it's fascinating to see the very creative answers that they give, and we're going to use those answers as a jumping point to really understand the story of Korach. Vayikach Korach ben Yitzar ben Kas ben Levi v'Datan v'Aviram b'nei Eliyav v'on and Pelet b'nei Reuven v'yakumu lifnei Moshe v'anashim b'nei Yisrael chamishim matayim l'siyada create moed anshei shem. And Korach, the son of Yitzar, took, and the son of Aviram, b'nei Eliyav, and On and Peles, and they stood up in front of Moshe. What's the question? Technical question. Very, very technical question that arises from the first pasuk. What did he take? Okay? What did he take? It says, as very often the Chazal will refer to, Ikar chaser min hasefer. It says that Korach and seemingly other people took, but it doesn't say what they took. What exactly did they take? We know that they stood up in front of Moshe. What did they take? And then all the Mefarshim deal with this question in one way or another. And it's fascinating to see the creative and very important answers that are suggested by the Mefarshim. So the first one I want us to look at is Targum Onkelos. Okay, Onkelos is a translation from the Torah into Aramaic. And sometimes through his translation, he will explain certain parts or certain questions. He doesn't necessarily mention the question, but just by the way that he explains the words in the Torah, he gives us an explanation. So says Onkelos, how does it describe the words Vayikach Korach? Says Onkelos, Ve'it peleg Korach. And Korach literally means Korach divided. Okay, the word it peleg in Aramaic word means like half or division. So Korach, says Onkelos, somehow divided something. What exactly does this mean? So Rashi, on the spot, explains it. What Onkelos is suggesting is that when it says that Korach took, it means Korach took himself. Korach took himself out of the community. Korach took himself out of the community. If you look very, very briefly, I'll read it inside very quickly. I'm sorry that they're a little out of order. Says Rashi, what does Vayikach Korach mean in source number 6? Lakach et atzmo litzad echad lihiyot nechlak bitoch ha'ida le'orer lakuna. He took himself to one side in order to be divided, or in order to separate himself, in order to then question the kuhuna. V'zeu shetirgum Onkelos v'it peleg nechlak misha'ar ha'ida lachzik b'machloket. He separated himself in order to create argument, in order to create machlokes. Okay, so explanation number 1 is, what does it mean by Yikach Korach? It means Korach took himself, he separated himself. He took himself out of the community in order to create the chaos that he would like to begin to sow. So let's understand. If that's what Korach did, if what Korach ultimately did was create division, so why doesn't the Torah just say division? What's the significance of saying Vayikach Korach? What according to Onkelos and according to Rashi, let's try to understand. What exactly is significant by the fact that the Torah uses the word Vayikach Korach? It could have just said, and Korach argued. And Korach created division.
He took unity out.
What do you mean? Excellent, correct.
Or he created doubt.
Good, excellent. Perhaps what the Torah is suggesting, according to Onkelos, is that the best way to begin to sow doubt or to create any kind of challenge is you first have to create division. Step number 1 to any kind of challenge that you're going to make to authority or any kind of whatever is you first need to see yourself and remove yourself and anybody else that you want to be a part of that and say it's us and it's them. Us and them. Us against them. We're not with them. That's beginning stages to creating rebellion. That's the beginning stages to challenging authority. You have to start that process by Vayikach Korach. Korach says, I now want to challenge authority. The way I need to do that is not from within. I need to separate myself. I need to take myself out of it, show that it's us versus them, and anyone who wants to follow me has to believe in that dichotomy, and only then can I then challenge the authority. Okay, so that's one interesting message that we're seeing already, just from this strange anomaly in the language. If we look at source number 3, the Medrash suggests a different approach. Vayikach here doesn't mean that he took himself. Rather, says the Medrash, Vayikach means he took others using words. But look at source number 3, says the Midrash, Vayikach ein Vayikach ela meshichat hadvarim rakim. It's the usage of very soft, persuasive language. Whenever the Torah wants to tell somebody, to convince somebody else to do something, to go somewhere, very often the language will be, take them here, take them. It doesn't mean you should physically pick them up and bring them. It means talk to them, and convince them, persuade them. Continues the Midrash, Shanimshechu kol gidolei Yisrael v'hasen sanhedraot acharav. So what was the Torah? When the Torah says Vayikach Korach, it means that Korach, who is this referring to? This is referring to, it says the Midrash and the Mefarshim, the 250 Nisiyei Ha'idah that Korach and his group were successful in convincing to join it. Okay, because it says, Vayikach Korach, it was Korach, and it was Datan va'Aviram, and On ben Peles. They all got together, and they convinced this group of 250 people to join them. The Moshe who Omer, Vayikach Moshe v'Aaron et hanashim ha'ela, v'chein kach et Aaron. Says the Midrash, very often when the Torah wants to tell somebody else, to command somebody to do something, the phrase that's used is Vayikach. Vayikach doesn't necessarily always mean a physical taking. Sometimes it can mean the power of words, the power of persuasion. And that's what Korach did. Korach went around, according to the Midrash, he went through the camp and he started saying, you think this is for me? This is really for you. Come join me. Come join me. Come join me. So according to this interpretation, Vayikach just basically, even though the Torah is not 100% accurate in how it's explaining it, it's referring to the fact that Korach and his men, i.e. Korach, Datan va'Aviram, and On, went around and brought and persuaded all these people, the 250 Nisei Aidah, to join his cause. His explanation number one was Korach took himself, separated himself. Explanation number two is, who did Korach take? What did Korach take? He took the people. How did he do so? Using the power of persuasion. Again, what's the significance? Why didn't it just say Vayidaber? Why does it say they use the word Vayikach? Why does the Torah use the word Vayikach often when it's referring to persuasion? Perhaps it's to show us the power of persuasion. That we often assume that when we refer to the phrase taking, we assume it means to physically take something or take somebody from one place to the next. And what the Torah is highlighting for us here is the power of persuasion, is the power of the spoken word. That there are certain people who have a certain koach, and they have an ability sometimes to get people to do things that maybe they couldn't have done in a physical way by physically doing something with them. But the power of the spoken word is incredibly strong, and that's what Korach was very good at. Korach was very good at convincing people, this isn't for me, this is for you. Come join me. And that's what the Midrash says, and the Rashbam points this out as well, that this was actually Korach taking everybody. But there is another technical question, which is, if Korach and Datan va'Aviram and On, they were all involved in persuading these people to join, there's another technical question on the pasuk. What does the pasuk say?
It's singular.
It's singular. It says Vayikach. Okay. Question number one was who did he take? Number two, the simple implication of the pasuk is that Korach wasn't the only one doing the taking. Who else was doing the taking? Datan and Aviram and On. So why does it say Vayikach? Why does it say singular? So I want us to think about that question. That's a big question according to this explanation. According to this explanation, that a group of people were persuading the 250 people to join them, why does it say Vayikach in singular? We're going to get to that soon. There's a fascinating explanation that the Netziv gives to why the phrase opened with Vayikach and puts it all on Korach as opposed to implicating everybody. The Chizkuni, in source number 5, agrees with the basic explanation that Vayikach meant persuasion of words, but because of this challenge with the singular Vayikach, he changes it and he says that this was really Korach convincing the other people in the pasuk. So source number 5, Vayikach Korach. What does Vayikach Korach mean? Lashon likichat anashim. It's a language to bringing people, persuading people. Umi lakach. Who did Korach take? Datan va'Aviram b'nei Eliyav v'on ben Peles b'nei Ruvain. It was Korach. The introduction, the beginning of this story was Korach first going to Datan va'Aviram, then going to On ben Pelet, and then only after that getting the other 250 people to join him in the pasuk. And says the Chizkuni, and if you're going to ask me, that doesn't fit in the pasuk, because the pasuk says Vayikach Korach v'Datan va'Aviram. Says the Chizkuni v'vav v'Datan yeterahu. You have extra vavs sometimes in the Torah. Sometimes the vav here is not what we would call lav dafka. It wasn't specific, and therefore, in this case, it was Korach who took them, and that's what the pasuk is talking. Again, a little bit of a technical point between the Rashbam and the Chizkuni, but according to these explanations, so far we've seen two explanations. Vayikach Korach. One was Korach took himself out of the equation. Korach took himself out of the situation in order to create the rebellion that he was about to create. And source number 2, suggestion number 2 is, what is Vayikach Korach? He used the power of persuasion to convince people to join him. Either it was him in a group convincing the 250 men to join him, or it was Korach himself going around and convincing all of them to join us. And the language of Vayikach is to show us the power of the spoken word and the power of persuasion. The Ramban does not like this explanation. The Ramban, in source number 7, argues, and he says Vayikach means something else. Vayikach doesn't mean taking yourself out. Vayikach doesn't just mean, like we said here, to create division. V'das hamidrash eno keperish harav. Says the Ramban. Ramban goes through all the different explanations, and he says this does not fit in. Aval amrusham ein vayikach ela lashon pliga shelibo lakcho. What does it mean? It doesn't mean that he created division. It means that he listened to his heart. Says the Ramban, the language of vayikach is a language of when a person pays attention to their inner desires and to their what we would call ta'avot. And they're different types of desires. Ki inman shene'emar ma'ikacha libecha. Ve'eno rotze lomar shelakach atzmo letzad echad. Ve'chein ma'ikachecha libecha. Eno sheyikach otcha letzad echad laflig atzmicha mishar b'nei adam. Aval, says the Midrash, says the Ramban, kavanat ha-midrash vayikach Korach shelakach etza b'libo la'asot ma sheyisaper. He trusted his conscience. Korach, in his mind, knew that he was justified in this rebellion. He felt that there was a lack of justification for what was happening, and he said, he was basically the best way to understand it is his heart basically pushed him to do something. He had this ta'ava for power. He had this ta'ava, or he was frustrated with the situation. And vayikach just basically means that Korach listened to his heart. Good question. Okay.
What did he say?
He asked, "What about Dasan Va'avira?" Meaning, good. He doesn't. The Ramban doesn't reference the language and all, and some of the technical points that we're raising. You're right. Some of Farshim deal with different questions, and it's a very good. We're going to get to Dasan Va'avira in a second. But what we've seen so far is that different explanations all seem to point to Korach as being the initial instigator, and then somehow bringing in Dasan Va'aviram, Od Ben Peles, and then eventually they bring in the other 250 people. But this exact question, the question of are they all the same or are they all different, actually leads the Netziv to make an astounding suggestion. The Netziv was very bothered by this entire process. He says, if you look at this entire story, we keep grouping together this whole group that we call Korach and his group. Okay, who do we have? Says the Netziv, you have to remember there are different groups here. You have Korach, then you have Datan Va'aviram, who we know from previous situations. You have this new person, On Ben Peles, who we don't really know so well, kind of new to the story. And then the other people who joined this rebellion are these 250 Nisiyei Yaida. And the question that many Mefarshim ask is, do they all have the same concerns? Or do they all have the same challenges? Or is this just kind of like a confluence of convenient claims? They just happen to come to a coalition. The best way to say it is a coalition of convenience. Is this a coalition of convenience where they all happen to have claims against Moshe Rabbeinu and Aaron? Or are they all on the same page? Says the Netziv, if you pay attention very carefully to the way the story plays out, to the different punishments that each of them receive, that shows that they were all in very different places. They all joined, but this was what we would call a coalition of convenience. But even more than that, some of them, argue the Netziv, even had different reasons for why they were meaning different, even had what we would call laudable intentions, positive intentions. Says the Netziv the following in source number 8. So first the Netziv explains the word vayikach to mean taking with words. So he joins those who say that vayikach just meant they were persuaded. But then says that Netziv something astounding. V'hinei, source number 8. It's a little bit long, we'll read pieces of it, but it's an amazing thing that he suggests. Lefi lashon hakatuv, vidatan va'aviram, muchach shegam hema hayu bilokche nefashot velo ben anifatim. Says the Netziv, if you look at the language, it's very clear from the language because of the Vav, that Datan and Aviram were part of the instigators. They weren't the ones being convinced. They were part of the instigators because the Pasuk says, Vayikach Korach v'Datan v'Aviram. So says the Netziv, back to the question we asked, V'im kain v'yikchu mibai. What should it say? It shouldn't say Vayikach Korach v'Datan v'Aviram. It should say Vayikchu. Why doesn't it say Vayikchu? Why does it say Vayikach? Aval yesh ladat ulehit bonein mikol inyan haparasha. Says the Netziv, you have to understand something very, very important regarding this parasha. We'll speak louder than them. We'll try to drown them out. Okay? Definitely frustrating, definitely annoying, but we're not going to let it stop us. Okay? Continues the Hemek Davar. Mehalichot hamachloket, the different parts of this machloket, if you follow along how they join the machloket, ume'onesh shehigia lahem, and the punishment they receive, kilo nishtavu be'erkam uvekavanat machlokotam Korach v'datam v'aviram v'ran ish. Ran ish, reish nun means the 250 men. If you look carefully, you're going to see that there's three groups. There's Korach and his intentions. There's Datan v'aviram and their intentions. He doesn't discuss On. I guess we would put On probably similar to Datan v'aviram. And then you have the 250 people. And each of them come to this not just for different reasons, but have almost entirely different intentions in terms of positive intentions versus negative intentions. He says, Sharei, Anu ro'im shelo hayu bichlal lokhe hamachtot ela Korach v'reish v'ran ish v'lo datan v'aviram. If you look at what happens later, when it comes to the bringing of the incense following this incident, the only people who bring the incense are Korach and the 250. What about Datan v'aviram? V'gam hinhig hamakom yitbarach kavod biran ish v'lo b'korach v'datan v'aviram kasher yuvar. And on some level, God gives a certain amount of respect to the 250 men that He doesn't give to Korach and Datan v'aviram. And as he points out later, who are the ones who die with the land opening up and swallowing? Korach, Datan v'aviram, but not the 250 men. So why are they getting different punishments? Therefore, says the Netziv, we're now the fifth line. Al kain yesh lahavin sheharan ish hayu be'emet gidolei Yisrael v'chol prat gam biyirat Hashem. He says, therefore, we must suggest the 250 men who joined this rebellion, they were actually tzaddikim, and they had the best of intentions. They weren't joining this in order to question his authority or as a power grab like Korach and Datan v'aviram. V'haya miniat hakuhuna shehu gorem dvekut v'avat Hashem ke'esh bo'er b'kirbam. Says the Netziv, why did these 250 people join? Because they knew that in order to get the closest possible to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, you have to be a Kohen. And they were they were on such a high level. He says, Bo'er b'kirbam, it was burning within them, this desire to achieve the highest closeness to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that they were going to do whatever they could in order to become Kohanim. And therefore, even though they knew that Moshe was right, and they knew that what they were doing, but it was almost as if a person, the best way that I can describe it is like religious zealotry. A person becomes so connected, or the desire to connect to spirituality, that they almost lose sight, or they lose a certain understanding of what's right and what's wrong, and that's what drove these 250 men. It was what we would call a holy type of rebellion. Thank you, a holy rebellion. And therefore he says, Lo l'shem... Sorry?
The means never justify the end.
Correct. Again, they were wrong. But what he's arguing is that their intentions were totally different than Korach and everybody else.
They were all Kohanim.
They were not Kohanim, but they wanted to be Kohanim. They were people who had a burning desire to achieve the level of Kuhuna, because that was to them the apex of connection to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That was the pinnacle of coming to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and therefore their challenge in rebelling here was not because they wanted power. It wasn't a power grab. It was what he would call, says the Netziv, a legitimate and sincere desire to become as close to God as they could. And they felt that this was the best way to do that. And that's why he says, Lo l'shem shrara v'kavod. This wasn't for honor. And this wasn't because they wanted to achieve a certain level. Hamidumeh ki'im lihit kadesh ulahasig ma'aleh al yedei avodah. They wanted to use the kahuna as a way to come as close as possible to HaKadosh Baruch Hu.
So they wanted God to change his mind?
It's a good question. Meaning, again, I think what the Netziv is highlighting here is that sometimes people don't have the purest intentions, and that still sometimes causes them. You want to call it religious zealotry, you want to call it some kind of a lost perspective. Sometimes people can get a certain level, and that itself, that level itself causes them to lose, if they're not grounded enough in reality or in what's going on, to lose perspective. It came from a totally different place. It came from a good place, but they got blinded. 100%. They got blinded. And then he even continues to say, Vigam, Hem Yadu Asher Diber Hashem Emet B'fi Moshe. They knew that Moshe was correct, that what Moshe was saying was correct. Ve'ein lahaher acharav, and they shouldn't be challenging Moshe. They knew that it was wrong what they were doing. Rak hirheru b'libam achar ratzon Hashem, umasru atzram l'misrut nefesh v'lamut al ahavat Hashem, ki aza kimot ahava. Kimavet ahava. Meaning they basically they were so full of love for Hashem that they took it to the extreme in a negative way, and that caused them to sin. So says, and then the Tziv continues and suggests, that was the 250 men. Then you had Datan v'Aviram. Says, who were Datan v'Aviram? They were rabble-rousers. That we know, says the Tziv, we know that they were coming from a totally different place. They always wanted to make problems. They were just looking to create problems, and therefore it's true that the 250 men connected with Datan and Aviram, but that was more out of convenience than anything else. You had the 250 men, they came from a place of wanting to connect to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Then you have Datan and Aviram, who were just problem makers. They were the ones who everyone knew were going to make the problems. They were always there. Any problem that ever happened to OUisrael, they were there. And then you had Korach. Who was Korach? So says the Netziv, Korach had the potential to be like the 250 men. And on some level, people sometimes might have seen him, and he might have appeared to people to be like the 250. But internally, he had negative intentions. It was all a power grab for him. He wasn't the problem maker that Datan and Aviram were. He wasn't the one who was always around. But in this case, it came from an internal, faulty understanding and a desire for power. And so says the Tziv, you have these three different groups, and then the Tziv goes on to describe, we're not going to do it inside just because of time. The Tziv goes on to describe that you had these three different groups, and each one needed the other. Because the 250 men, they wanted to achieve this kahuna in order to achieve the highest level of closeness to God, but they weren't problem people. They couldn't create a rebellion on their own. So who did they attach themselves to? To the Datan v'Aviram, who were problem people but needed people to join them. So everybody, like we said before, was a coalition of convenience. You had these three different groups. You had Korach, you had Datan v'Aviram, and you had the 250 men, who all had different intentions and different desires and different levels of what they were thinking, what they wanted. And they only came together for one reason. And that was, it was convenient because this was the best way to achieve what they wanted to achieve. Says the Netziv, why does the Torah open up with Vayikach Korach as opposed to Korach and Datan v'Aviram? Because Korach was the main instigator. The Torah wants to show us that this all started with Korach. Korach was a master at finding the different groups that were going to be able to join him for different reasons in order to create the problems that he wanted to create, in order to achieve his own goals. Yes?
I want to understand why, if they were really tzaddikim, and they really wanted to be, the 250 wanted to get as close as they could, and their intentions were so good and positive, and they were on such a level, why would they agree to go with somebody who is obvious to them not? And you said, they kind of got blinded, but something doesn't.
So it's an excellent question, and by the way, he's the first person I've seen to make this suggestion. It's a michudash suggestion. I mean, the simple understanding is these 250 people were people who also wanted power, but he, based on different parts of the text, he makes the suggestion. And I think what the Netziv is saying is exactly what I've said before: is there's different ways that people sometimes will make mistakes. Some people make mistakes because, or will make wrong decisions or create problems. Sometimes that will happen out of what we would call negative intentions, negative desires. I want power, I want this, I want that. You also have people who sometimes are so to the other extreme. They're so blinded by the spirituality that they're not grounded enough in reality. And that can happen as well. And I'm sure we've all seen examples of individuals who, let's say, they become firm, they become religious, not necessarily Baalei Tshuva even, but they get caught up in the tidal wave of spirituality and what we would call kirvatu HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that if that spiritual desire isn't grounded in a certain sense of reality, it can take them in different locations, different places. And I think that's what happened here, was that they just got swept up in that what he refers to as this avat Hashem and this desire for dveikut b'Hashem, that they weren't grounded in the reality of that has to happen in a certain way, and it can't just happen in any way that you want to, and you can't just, the way he even says it, they were willing to sacrifice themselves on the altar out of their love for Hashem, which means that there was something not healthy about the way that they were doing that. And we've seen that in our lives. I'm sure we've seen different types. There's some people who sometimes get swept up in a certain spiritual vigor that if it's not grounded in a certain reality, it can be very, very dangerous. And that's, I think, what happened here. And that's what happened to these 200. I mean, again, we'll never really know, but that's my understanding of what the Nitziv is saying. Okay, so what we've seen here so far is, again, a few different, varied and different interpretations. According to this Nitziv, the Nitziv is pointing out that this entire, what we call Korach ve'adato, Korach and his group, were actually varied people. It was very different groups, different people coming, a coalition of convenience, coming from very, very different places. In fact, the Nitziv isn't the only one who says this. A number of other Mefarshim point out the same thing. The Chassam Sofer, in source number 9, also suggests that each of the members of the group had different reasons for why they were revolting. He doesn't say things as extreme as the Nitziv, but he also points out that this was really a coalition of convenience. Vayikach Korach, hine, Korach im adato, source number 9, lo hayu rotzim davar echad. They didn't all want one thing. This wasn't like a principled rebellion where they all had one main goal, one main purpose. This was everyone coming together. Anyone who wanted to question Moshe, anyone who wanted to challenge Moshe, all came together. V'lo ba'u b'shvil davar echad. It wasn't all for one thing. Ela ran ish, the 250 people, hayu bechorim. They were bechorim. They were originally firstborn. Ba'u lachlok al haleviyim sheba'ut murata bechorim. The 250 people were complaining because soon after Matan Torah was when, after Cheda Ega was when God had replaced the bechorim with the Leviim, and they weren't happy about that. They said that's not fair. Why should we lose out on our ability to serve in the Beit Hamikdash? Why? So they were rebelling about that. Ve'efshar shelekach hizdakakum mishevet Ruvain, and that's why they had to get some of Shevet Ruvain. Shema gamatam hayalachlok gam al mashinatal Yaakov chelek bechora me Ruvain until the Shevet Yosef. And then you had Od ben Pelet and Natan va'Aviram who were from Shevet Ruvain, and they were complaining because their forefather Ruvain was the real Bechor. And what had Yaakov done? Yaakov had replaced Ruvain with Yosef. So therefore, you had all these different disparate people coming and arguing. Reuven was coming. People from Shevet Reuven were coming and saying, "Why is our Shevet losing out on getting the leadership?" You had the Bechorim coming and saying, "Why is Shevet Levi getting the leadership?" Ironically, where's Korach from? Shevet Levi. So if anything, the 250 people, Korach is coming and saying, "Why are you getting it? I should get it within Shevet Levi." And the 250 people who are coming and supporting Korach themselves didn't want Korach to have it either because they were claiming the Bechorim should have it. So what you see here is not just a coalition of convenience. You have competing interests all coming together to create this problem. He just wanted to argue on the kuna. And Datan v'Aviram were just coming to create problems. They all took their each individual interests and came together. So we have two different interpretations. You have and by the way, there's many others who come and explain the similar idea that Korach v'Adato were not a unified front. And this understanding explains something very, very interesting in Pirkei Avot, which many of you may be familiar with. There's a fascinating Mishnah in Pirkei Avot that raises a fundamental question that we can now answer. The Mishnah in Pirkei Avot, and the Chassam Sofer mentions this, the Mishnah in Masechet Avot in Perek Hey discusses what is considered to be a machloket l'shem shamayim, and what is a machloket shelo l'shem shamayim. What is a machloket that's for the heaven of God, for the name of for God, and what is not? Kol, says the Mishnah in Avot, source number 10, Kol machloket shehi l'shem shamayim sofa lehitkayim. Any machloket which is for the sake of heaven will ultimately continue. V'she'eno will exist, will continue to exist. V'she'ena l'shem shamayim, and any machloket which is not l'shem shamayim, ein sofa lehitkayim. It will not ultimately be able to continue to exist. Says the Mishnah, Ezu hi machloket shehi l'shem shamayim. What is a prime example of a machloket that is l'shem shamayim? Zu machloket Hillel v'Shamai. The machloket that we see between Hillel and Shammai and between Beit Hillel and Shammai, where they respect each other. They're both searching for the truth. They're both striving to find the correct answer, the correct psak. That, says the Mishnah, is a classic example of machloket l'shem shamayim. What is a machloket she'ena l'shem shamayim? V'she'ena l'shem shamayim zu machloket Korach v'kol adato. This is the machloket of Korach and his group. Now there's something very inconsistent here in this Mishnah. What's the inconsistency in this Mishnah?
It's not Korach against the other. No, it's Korach against
Excellent. The machloket l'shem shamayim, you brought the two sides, Hillel and Shammai. If we want to continue that parallel to the machloket shelo l'shem shamayim, it should be Korach and who was the other side of Korach? Moshe. Korach should be Korach v'Moshe. Or Korach ve'adato v'im Moshe v'Aaron. Why does the Mishnah end and call it Korach ve'adato? So there's many different answers that are given. Many of the Mepharshim point out that what this shows and is highlighting is that even Korach ve'adato were ultimately going to be against each other. That even though, had Korach been successful in his rebellion against Moshe and Aaron, soon after that rebellion, what would have happened to that group, to that coalition of convenience? It would have broken easily into different groups. They would have started fighting with each other. So it really was Korach against those who are with him, because they weren't united on principle. They were united out of convenience, and it would have very, very quickly turned into turning against each other. And I think, again, when we think about lessons for today, and I'm sure many of us could give many different types of examples. We're not going to get into any political or anything of that sort. But we see this often, and it's not. We see it in our leadership in this country and in other countries. And it's not. Again, I'm not here to say right or wrong, but how often do we see this example of people just jumping on the bandwagon to cause rebellion in different circles, right or wrong, out of convenience more than out of anything else? And whereas we should strive for a society where our unity is based on certain principles. And of course we can disagree, but what we focus on is what we agree on, as opposed to focusing on who we don't like or what we don't like without really dealing with the issues. We see this already starting from the time of Korach and applying until today. Yes?
The Torah and the commentaries seem to be focusing entirely, as I see it, on Korach and Datan and Aviram. What is the role of Unben Pellet?
It's a good question. And again, I would say even more than that. The challenging part about Unben Pellet is that he seems to disappear from the story. He appears in the beginning of the story, and then he seems to disappear from the story. So Rashi quotes a medrash. Rashi quotes the medrash that eventually Owen did the right thing, then listened to his wife, and which maybe we should all do. And his wife convinced him to stop. His wife convinced him to. So it's a good question. And I didn't do the prop. I can't say I have understanding of a range of opinions about it. Unben Pellet seems to be someone who was in the beginning swept up. According to different interpretations, he was son of Ruvain. So if you want to understand it that way, that maybe he was part of this Ruvain group that wanted to get more power, that was jealous. If you want to take the Sam Sofer's approach, that he was jealous. And at some point, his wife said to him, this isn't going to work. And he just disappears. Now, he could have then turned around and taken Moshe's side, but he doesn't. He just kind of slowly disappears. And from what we understand, he didn't continue, and therefore he wasn't punished. That seems to be the simple understanding, because he didn't continue in the rebellion. At some point, he wisened up. Why? His wife, according to the Medrash, his wife basically. Rashi quotes the Medrash that said that his wife basically said to him, "This is not a smart thing to get involved in," and convinced him not to continue in the rebellion. Yes.
At some point, I don't know where or how, I heard that his wife, in order to dissuade him, uncovered her hair and no one could come in to get him at his hands.
Okay. That could be, that sounds like a Medrash. It sounds like another Medrash or the same Medrash. It could be, I haven't seen. I don't believe Rashi quotes that full story, but I wouldn't be surprised if that, meaning she took drastic measures to kind of get him to see something. That very well could be. Yes?
But where was Aaron in all of this? He was the peacemaker. He couldn't go.
It's a great question. Aaron is there. We see in the very beginning that Aaron was called, is part of it. They're challenging Aaron. Aaron's very much a part of the story. It seems to be that there's a limit even to that. That sometimes you have people who come with a certain agenda, and they're even peace or a peacemaker can only work when the two sides have some kind of ratzon to do that. Again, that's my own understanding, but that's what it seems to be. Okay, so let's continue on in our conversation. We've seen a number of different interpretations of what does Vayikach mean. I want to share with you a few more interpretations that I think also, again, bring out new sides to the story and new understandings to the story that are very, very relevant for today. We started with what does Vayikach Korach mean? What did Korach take? So many Mefarshim point to a well-known medrash that Korach took certain objects. What objects did Korach take? Look at source number 10. Vayikach Korach. That says the Midrash, Maktiv Limala. What's the Parsha right before this? The end of last week's Parsha starts to talk about the Parsha of Tzitzit. So what does Tzitzit have to do with the story of Korach? Maktiv Limala Minyanyan Ve'asu Lehem Tzitzit. So Korach, when it says Vayikach Korach, he actually took certain objects. And that was part of his challenge to Moshe Rabbeinu. This is a well-known Midrash. Kafatz Korach v'yamar leMoshe. He got up and he grabbed tzitzis and he grabbed to Moshe. He said, Moshe, talis shekula tcheles. Mahu shetehei p'tura min tzitzis. If I have a beged, a garment that is made of tchelet, made of the color blue, do I have to then tie the strings on it? And Moshe said, according to the halacha, yes. Amar le chayevet b'tzitzis. Of course, that's what the halacha says. Amar le Korach. Korach said that makes no sense. Talis shekula tcheles ein poteret atzma arba chutin poteret ota. If the whole thing is made of tchelet, that's not going to potter it from the tzitzis, but you're only having the four strings, that's what makes the difference? Says Korach, that makes no sense. Moshe, your arguments, your halachic arguments make no sense. And then he continued, Bayit malei sfarim. If you have a house that is full of sfarim, ma'hu sheyehe patur min hamezuzah? Is it patur from mezuzah? Amar lo, no, chayiv b'mezuzah. It's chayiv in mezuzah, which is the halacha. You still need a mezuzah even if your house is full of sfarim. Amar le, kol haTorah kula. Reish ayin hey parshiot ena poteret tabayit parsha achat shebimezuzah poteret tabayit. If all the Torah, all the different parshiot are in the house, that's not going to absolve the house of then putting one parsha or one parsha in the mezuzah. That's what's going to solve it. Said Korach, this makes no sense. And according to this midrash, Korach was challenging. What was the main rebellion here? What we would call a challenge of Moshe's authority. He was challenging Moshe's authority. He was coming and saying, Moshe, the halacha that you've been telling us makes no sense. In one of his most famous drashot, given many, many years ago, Rav Soloveitchik describes Korach's rebellion as what he calls the common sense rebellion against halakhic authority. And I brought for you here, again, it's a long piece that I brought. It's a much longer piece than what I brought for you here. But again, the echoes of the challenges that we're hearing that were back then and are echoed. By the way, Soloveitchik was saying this 30 years ago, 35 years ago. And the relevance of that today is something that I think is frightening, but yet prescient. Look at source number 11. It says for Soloveitchik, Korach's argument was all about common sense. Jews would defer only to recognized Torah scholars in the interpretation of Jewish law. Today, many individuals claim the right to exercise their own common sense in determining the relevance and format of contemporary Judaism, despite the fact that they are hardly biblical and Talmudic scholars. Synagogue ritual committees and popular magazine articles debate the continued usefulness of various religious practices and explore the possibilities of reformulating Judaism in line with modern thought. These self-styled poskim concede their lack of formal training in Jewish texts and sources, but they insist nonetheless on their right to decide fundamental religious questions on the basis of common sense. This is not a recent phenomenon, says Rav Soloveitchik. It dates back to the earliest period of Jewish history, to the very generation which received the Torah from Har Sinai. Not long after that event, the Torah relates Korach led a rebellion against Moshe and Chazal implies, that he sought to replace Moshe as the teacher and leader of Israel. Korach publicly challenged the halachic competency of Moshe and ridiculed his interpretation of Jewish law as being contrary to elementary reason. And again, the Rav then goes on to describe what had happened. I skipped that for you. But we know that he brought the mezuzah and he said, why do I need a mezuzah if it's a house full of sperm? Or why do I need the strings if it's a tzitzis full of tchelet? Continues Rav Soloveitchik, now we know that every rebellion against authority needs an ideology to arouse the fervor of the people and sustain its momentum. It needs a slogan or a motto which projects a noble ideal to replace the intolerable status quo. The rallying cry which Korach chose was common sense. He proclaimed that all reasonable people have the right to interpret Jewish law according to their best understanding. For all the community are holy. He claimed if kulam kidoshim, then they all are on the same level to determine whether something makes sense or doesn't make sense. In down-to-earth logic, the lowliest woodcutter is the equal of Moshe. This appeal to populism evokes considerable support because it promises freedom from centralized authority. It flatters the people's common intelligence, and it approves the right of each Jew or group of Jews to follow their own individual judgment. Says Rav Soloveitchik, Korach was an intelligent man. The Medrash even says, Pikeach haya. He would have certainly conceded there were specialized fields in which only experts who have studied extensively over many years are entitled to be recognized as authorities. Today, reasonable people concede the authority of mathematicians, physicists, and physicians in their areas of expertise, and would not think of challenging them merely on the basis of common sense. By the way, I think that's changed. Even today, people do that, right? Even in those fields nowadays, people will say, well, that doesn't make much sense to me, so I'm not going to listen to the physicians or the physicists. But back then, at least, it was considered acceptable. So why, then, are so many well-intentioned people ready to question the authority of the Torah scholar, the lamdan, in his area of specialized knowledge? And then, again, this is a much longer piece, but I wanted to bring some of the main points. What was Korach's basis? What was Korach challenging? Why did he suggest that common sense has to make sense? So says Rav Soloveitchik, Korach was committed to the doctrine of religious subjectivism, which regards one's personal feelings as primary in the religious experience. God requires the heart. The Gemara says, Rachmana libabai, and it is in the mysterious recesses of his personality that man meets his maker. The mitzvot, by contrast, are physical acts which reflect the inner quest, the hidden feelings of religious emotion. The mitzvah is an external form of a spiritual experience. Each inner experience has its external correlate in the form of particular mitzvot. On the basis of Korach's theory, the mitzvah would have to correspond to the mood that prompts it. The value of the mitzvah is not to be found in its performance, but in its subjective impact upon the person, its ability to arouse a devotional state of mind. Basically, it says, for Korach, it was all about how I feel. Does the mitzvah make sense to me? Does the mitzvah feel good to me? Do I feel good when I do it? In Judaism, it is the mitzvah which initiates religious experience. That's what Soloveitchik. Of course we want that experience. Of course we want to feel good. But we start with, we do the mitzvah. We do the commandments. We follow the halakha. And then we hope that through a proper understanding of that halakha, that will then bring about the impact that we're looking for. The halachic legal system, as a chachma, has its own methodology, mode of analysis, conceptualized rationale, even as to mathematics and physics. Similarly, oral law has its own epistemological approach, which can be understood only by a lamdan who has mastered its methodology and its abundant material. And I want to just clarify. This doesn't mean that that everybody doesn't have what to gain from studying Torah. We all can gain from studying Torah. We all can gain from learning Torah. We all have what to add to Torah. But when it comes to making big decisions regarding areas of halakha, or what's considered appropriate, what's not considered appropriate, we have to, says Rav Soloveitchik, and this is what Korach was arguing against, recognize the halachic Torah authority. Now again, who are the halachic Torah authorities that we follow? That might be a big debate, and that might be something that people have to find their own halachic authority that they believe has studied the Torah long enough to be able to give them a certain perspective on things. But for every single person to come in and say, well, this doesn't make sense to me, and this doesn't make sense to me, that, says Rav Soloveitchik, that was Korach's argument. The common sense rebellion against Torah authority was coming and saying, this doesn't make sense. What you're saying doesn't make sense, and therefore I'm going to outright reject it. That, says Rav Soloveitchik, shows a lack of understanding of the whole world, the whole corpus of halacha. Just as mathematics is more than a group of equations, and physics is more than a collection of natural laws, so too the halacha is more than a compilation of religious laws. It has its own logos and method of thinking and is an autonomous, self-integrated system. The halacha need not make common sense any more than mathematics and scientific conceptualized systems need to accommodate themselves to common sense. Last paragraph before we move on. When people talk of a meaningful halacha, of unfreezing halacha, or of empirical halacha, they are basically proposing Korach's approach. Lacking a knowledge of halachic methodology, which could only be achieved through extensive study, they instead apply common sense reasoning, which is replete with platitudes and cliches. As in Aristotelian physics, they judge phenomena solely from surface appearances and note only the subjective sensations of the worshippers. This data approach is not tolerated in science, and it should not receive serious credence in halacha. Such statements are pseudo-statements, lacking sophistication about depth, relationships, and meanings. Okay, as I said, this was one of Rav Soloveitchik's most famous drashot that he gave, where he suggested that Korach was representing the common argument against halacha by saying this doesn't make sense, and every single person have the ability to decide halacha. And we believed, just as in other areas of study, in other areas of expertise, that a person needs to spend a certain amount of years learning, mastering, and understanding the text in order to be able to make the proper conclusions regarding halacha. Halacha applies to the common man, and Torah is certainly relevant to every single one of us in so many different ways. But when it comes to making decisions on halacha, especially big decisions, those have to be left to the authorities, to the Torah authorities, just like we would in all other fields. So that is another approach that we've seen, which was the approach of Vayikach meant he took objects, he challenged them, he went and took things and went to Moshe and said, this doesn't make sense. I'd like to share with you two more approaches, and I know we're getting close to the end of time, so we're going to go a little bit quicker. Two other approaches, one my father suggested and one from Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch. My father points out that he said that what is Vayikach Korach? Perhaps we can suggest the following idea. Korach took. By taking it means he picked and chose the things that he wanted to say. As my father points out, he says it here, it's number 12 here. Korach's rebellion, it's in the end of the first paragraph, is dangerous not because it was devoid of truth, but because it was a manipulation of truth. Real understanding of what happened here was Korach came and said things that were true. Kulam Kidoshim. Kol ha'ida, kulam, everyone is true. That is true. That's a true statement. Everything that whole statement that Korach said was right. But then Korach took it a step further and said, because we're all holy, therefore we're all equal. Therefore we all are the same. And you can't have a leadership role that I can have. And so Korach's danger was, what does it mean by Yikach Korach? And he took? Korach picked and chose aspects of truth in order to then shape them and form them in the way that he wanted. In order to take, the danger was, if he had said something that was entirely false from the beginning, no one would have listened to him. Why did they listen to him? Because he started with the truth. He started with the things that made sense. He started with something that was true. Kol ha'ida kulam kedoshim. And then he said, and therefore, lama tisnasu al kal Hashem. Why should you be chosen? The answer is, we are all holy. We all are holy in the realm, as my father distinguishes between relationship and role. In the realm of relationship, we all have a relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We all are holy. We all can have a relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But in the realm of role, our jobs within the Jewish community, we can't all be the same. We can't all be Moshe Rabbeinu by definition. Certain roles are given to certain people by different circumstances at birth, and that's a reality which we face. And just because we're all holy doesn't mean we also are all the same when it comes to our role. And that was the danger. Vayikach Korach came, and again, something that I think echoes to us in today's world, where people will take aspects of truth and then use that to manipulate the truth in order to achieve a certain agenda that they're trying to achieve. Something that Korach did as well. And Rav Hirsch we'll end with Rav Hirsch. His opening statement was, what does Vayikach Korach mean? It's more a statement, a description of Korach, than it is a statement of what Korach did. Who was Korach? Korach was a taker. Says Rav Hirsch, there are givers and there are takers in this world. And Vayikach Korach is showing Korach's whole concern, all he cared about in this whole story was himself. His own authority, his own power. And therefore the Torah introduces this entire story with Vayikach Korach. He didn't take anything specific. What he did was his whole personality, his whole essence, his whole goal was to take. And that's why the Torah opens up with Vayikach Korach, because it's describing Korach's mentality as he enters, as we begin this story. So we saw a number of different interpretations for what the word Vayikach can mean. Vayikach can mean many different things. We're not going to go over them because of time. But what we've seen here again is that even just one small anomaly in the psukim, a whole range of interpretations. Each of them sharing with us tremendous wisdom that was relevant both back then and also relevant to us today. Thank you all. Wishing everybody a wonderful week.